Protesters, thousands of them, have taken to the streets in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, opposing President Ouattara's bid for a fourth term.
Après mûre réflexion,
after careful consideration and in good conscience, I am announcing to you today that I have decided to be a candidate for the presidential election.
Critics of Ouattara accuse him of tightening his grip on power.
In Abidjan's blazing heat, a crowd roars, not from celebration, but from a nation's breaking point. The streets of Abidjan aren't chanting for victory, they are warning of a democracy on the edge of collapse. In this video, we are going to look at why Ivory Coast's upcoming election has sparked fear, fury, and fierce resistance. President Ouattara's decision to run for a fourth term, enabled by a controversial legal interpretation, has coincided with the barring of his strongest rivals. Protests in districts like Yopougon have transformed into nationwide movements, echoing past political crises that claimed thousands of lives. We'll break down the key players, the deep divisions driving unrest, and the possible futures awaiting Ivory Coast. In a region fraught with coups and instability, this decision could change everything. Today, it's defined by the steady, unbroken pounding of thousands of feet on the streets. Every chant cuts through the air like a blade. Enough is enough. No true democracy without true justice. This isn't the background noise of a restless capital. It's the roar of a people on the brink of a political reckoning. For weeks, tension has been building in whispers, debates, and coffee shop conversations. But now it's out in the open, raw, loud, and impossible to ignore. Because just months before the October 2025 presidential elections, a political decision has sent shockwaves through the nation. The country's electoral body has barred some of the most influential opposition figures from even appearing on the ballot. And among those sidelined are two men whose names have long divided opinion. Laurent Gbagbo, the former president whose legacy is as disputed as it is enduring, and Tidjane Thiam, the former Credit Suisse CEO and a global finance heavyweight who returned to his homeland to run for the highest office. It is an unlikely pairing, one a veteran of Ivory Coast political trenches, the other a man of boardrooms and international deals, but they had found a shared mission to challenge an 83-year-old incumbent who refuses to step aside. That man is President Alassane Ouattara. Ouattara is a figure of contrasts. To his supporters, he's a modernizer who brought stability, built infrastructure, and restored economic confidence. To his critics, he's a master of political longevity, willing to bend the rules to hold on to power. Nearly a decade ago, he oversaw constitutional changes that scrapped presidential term limits. Now, with a new legal interpretation in his favor, he is bidding for a fourth term. In a country where elections have often been a prelude to unrest and where the wounds of political violence still ache like they happened yesterday, this is not just a contest for a title. It is a test of identity, of whether Ivory Coast will choose a path of reconciliation and true democratic renewal or stumble again into familiar chaos. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to understand the ghost that hovers over it, history. Ivory Coast is a land of contrasts. It boasts the second-largest economy in West Africa, its ports buzzing with cargo ships, and its cocoa plantations supply more than 40% of the world's chocolate. Its capital, Abidjan, is often called the Paris of West Africa, a city of skyscrapers, luxury hotels, and vibrant nightlife. Yet, beneath the glossy surface lies a history of deep political fractures. The year 2000 saw an election that split the nation, with disputed results igniting violence. A decade later, the 2010 presidential contest between Gbagbo and Ouattara spiraled into a deadly standoff that claimed over 3,000 lives. The crisis displaced hundreds of thousands and left behind a legacy of mistrust that no amount of economic growth could fully erase. When Ouattara finally assumed office in 2011, he came with promises, stability, unity, and prosperity. And for a time, it seemed like the country was on a new path. Bridges rose over lagoons, highways carved away across the country, and foreign investment poured in. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank applauded the nation's economic performance. But while the cranes worked and the GDP climbed, another reality was taking shape. Political opposition was shrinking, critical voices were sidelined, and the presidency grew ever more centralized. Many began to feel that stability was coming at the cost of political openness. In July 2025, Ouattara ended months of speculation by confirming that he would run again. His argument: the constitutional reforms of 2016 effectively reset the clock on his mandates. The Constitutional Council agreed, clearing the path for his candidacy. For many Ivorians, this felt all too familiar. It mirrored a broader West African trend. Leaders in Guinea, Togo, and elsewhere using legal loopholes to stretch their time in office. Civil society groups warned that this was a dangerous precedent. Opposition leaders accused the president of undermining democracy itself. But the controversy deepened when the Independent Electoral Commission disqualified 4 heavyweight challengers from the race. Laurent Gbagbo, a political survivor, loved by his base and loathed by his critics. He had returned from exile in 2021 after being acquitted by the International Criminal Court of Crimes Against Humanity. For his supporters, he is a wronged leader who stood against foreign meddling. For others, he is a reminder of the bloodshed and instability of the past. Tidjane Thiam, a cosmopolitan figure with a reputation untarnished by the country's past conflicts. Having led one of Europe's largest banks and served in Ivorian government decades earlier, Thiam represented a fresh, globally connected face. His disqualification, officially due to dual nationality at the time of his candidacy filing, was seen by his camp as a politically motivated technicality. The other barred figures, Guillaume Soro, a former prime minister now living in exile, and Charles Bourgoud, the firebrand youth leader from Gbagbo's camp, represented additional blows to the diversity of the ballot. To the opposition, this was not coincidence. It was a calculated move to narrow the playing field before the game even began. The disqualifications lit a fuse. By August, the protests had swelled, with Yopougon, Abidjan's sprawling working-class district, becoming the movement's beating heart. The protests were a blend of defiance and desperation. Women wrapped in colorful pagnas danced as a form of resistance. Youths clung to lampposts, megaphones in hand, leading chants that echoed through the streets. Elderly men and women carried faded photographs of political martyrs, their faces a living reminder of past sacrifices. But when security forces moved in, the atmosphere shifted. Tear gas rolled through the crowds. Protesters scattered, regrouped, and returned, their resolve hardened. Arrests followed, including 6 members of Gbagbo's party accused of inciting violence, charges they deny. For many, the crackdown was proof that the election was less about democracy and more about control. Ouattara's supporters argue that Ivory Coast cannot afford instability. They point to regional crises, coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, and insist that Ouattara's steady hand has kept Ivory Coast from slipping into the same fate. Cocoa exports remain strong. Investors still come. The roads keep getting built. But critics counter with a warning: stability without fairness is an illusion. Silencing dissent in the name of order, they argue, is the surest way to provoke the very chaos the government claims to prevent. And as October draws near, that debate, stability versus openness, is no longer academic. It is playing out in the streets, in homes, and in the quiet conversations between friends who wonder if history is about to repeat itself. What is happening in Ivory Coast is not just an Ivorian story. It is part of a deeper, more troubling rhythm echoing across West Africa, a rhythm many citizens are growing tired of hearing. In Guinea, Alpha Condé's third-term bid in 2020 ignited violent protests, leading to bloodshed and ultimately a military coup. In Togo, the Nassingbe dynasty has held power for over 5 decades, reshaping the constitution whenever necessary to keep the family name in the presidential palace. Even in Senegal, a country once hailed as a beacon of democratic stability, the mere suggestion that President Macky Sall might run for a 3rd term in 2024 triggered weeks of protests before he eventually ruled it out. The pattern is as familiar as it is dangerous. Leaders elected with promises of change, later bending rules to stay in power, each claiming it's for the good of the nation. And for a continent with one of the youngest populations in the world, the message this sends is corrosive, that democracy is a performance, not a promise. For Ivory Coast opposition, the disqualification of their most prominent figures is more than a setback. It is a dismantling of their electoral strategy. Without Gbagbo, the African People's Party Côte d'Ivoire, PPSI, risks losing the electrifying rallies and deep grassroots loyalty that have been its greatest strength. Without Thiam, the Democratic Party of Côte d'Ivoire, PDCI, loses its bridge to the international community and a leader capable of attracting urban, middle-class voters. Jean-Louis Billon, who now head the PDCI, has tried to rally support by promoting a vision of generational renewal, arguing that the country cannot afford another decade of the same leadership. But without the magnetism of Thiam's candidacy, the message struggles to reach beyond his party's core base. Some opposition groups call for dialogue, hoping to negotiate a way back into the race. Others believe only relentless street pressure can force the government to reconsider. But the challenge is unity. A fractured opposition is exactly what a determined incumbent needs to maintain control. October 25, 2025, is not simply an election date. It is a litmus test for Ivory Coast institutions, its stability, and the region's confidence in its democratic process. There are three main possible outcomes. A controlled victory for Ouattara, where the election is conducted under tight control, unrest is contained, and business continues as usual, but deep political resentment simmers beneath the surface, ready to ignite later. A negotiated compromise, where sustained protests or international pressure lead to the reinstatement of some opposition candidates, salvaging the credibility of the election, but leaving questions about the integrity of the process. Or escalation into crisis, where protests spiral, violence erupts, and the country relives the political chaos of 2010 to 2011, with devastating consequences for its economy and social fabric. Whatever the outcome, Ivory Coast's position as the economic engine of Francophone West Africa means that instability here will send tremors across the region, threatening trade, investment, and even political stability of its neighbors. The government's defenders frame the choice as one between sustained prosperity and political risk. They point to gleaming infrastructure projects, a growing GDP, and continued investor confidence as evidence that Ouattara's leadership is delivering. In a region plagued by coups and economic collapse, they argue Ivory Coast is a rare success story. Why jeopardize that? But critics insist that true prosperity cannot be built on political exclusion. Roads and bridges may dazzle the eye, but they argue that without inclusive governance, such progress is built on shaky foundations. If political tensions erupt, the same investors praising Ivory Coast today could flee tomorrow. And for many Ivorians, it's not an abstract debate. It's about whether they feel they have a voice in their country's future, or whether that future is being decided for them, behind closed doors. The current wave of protest is not spontaneous chaos. It is rooted in lived experience. Many in the streets today marched in 2000. Some fought in 2010. Others lost family members in past political crises. These are not just political supporters. They are survivors of a history that has taught them the cost of silence. In Yopougon, the chants are more than slogans. They are a collective memory turned into action. Mothers recall burying their children after Election Day violence. Youths who were barely teenagers during the last crisis now find themselves leading chants for justice. Elderly men carry signs that read, "Never again." The message is clear. The people have seen this path before, and they know where it can lead. As the election nears, international observers are watching closely. The African Union, ECOWAS, and the United Nations have all quietly urged restraint on all sides, wary of another West African crisis in a year already filled with instability. But diplomatic statements alone cannot bridge the widening gap between Ivory Coast's ruling elite and its restless citizenry. The outcome here will be read as a signal across the region. If a fourth term secured through legal reinterpretation and the sidelining of major opponents is accepted without consequence, it could embolden other leaders to follow the same playbook. Conversely, if public pressure forces concessions, it could inspire reform movements elsewhere. While the streets of Abidjan throb with chants and defiance, another battlefield exists far from the cameras. The polished offices of the presidency, the dimly lit conference rooms of party headquarters, and the hushed corridors of the Independent Electoral Commission. In these spaces, the election is being fought in a very different way. Hey, the weapons are not megaphones and placards, but legal clauses, procedural deadlines, and strategic alliances. For Ouattara's camp, the priority is maintaining the appearance of legality while ensuring that no serious challenger can disrupt the path to a fourth term. Every disqualification has been justified with precise references to electoral law, dual citizenship, unresolved legal cases, incomplete paperwork. To the average citizen, it feels clinical, almost bureaucratic. But to seasoned political watchers, it is clear that this is calculated political engineering. Meanwhile, within the opposition, the atmosphere is far less orderly. With their figureheads removed from a ballot, party operatives scrambled to decide whether to boycott the election, back secondary candidates, or keep pushing for reinstatement. The lack of unity is a gift to the incumbent. The more fragmented the opposition, the easier it is to win even in the face of widespread public dissatisfaction. To understand why Gbagbo's exclusion resonates so strongly, you have to know his story. Once a history professor, he became a fierce critic of the one-party rule of Felix Houphouët-Boigny, Ivory Coast's founding president. Gbagbo spent years in exile before returning to challenge the political order, eventually winning the presidency in 2000. His rule was marked by conflict. The 2002 civil war split the country in two, with rebels controlling the north and the government holding the south. Yet Gbagbo remained defiant, often casting himself as a nationalist resisting foreign interference. In 2010, when Ouattara was declared the winner of the presidential election by the Electoral Commission, Gbagbo refused to concede. The resulting standoff led to months of violence and the intervention of UN and French forces, culminating in Gbagbo's arrest. He was sent to The Hague to face charges of crimes against humanity, charges from which he was ultimately acquitted in 2019. His return in 2021 was nothing short of dramatic. Crowds lined the streets, waving banners that read, "Welcome home, President." His party saw revival, and for many of his supporters, his candidacy in 2025 was not just political, it was personal. His exclusion has left a gaping hole in their hopes. If Gbagbo is a hardened survivor of Ivory Coast turbulent politics, Tidjane Thiam is the outsider who built his reputation abroad. Born into a prominent Ivorian family with political and royal lineage, Thiam was a star student, graduating from France's elite École Polytechnique and École Nationale des Ponts et Chaussées. His early career was in government, where he served as Minister of Planning and Development in the 1990s. But it was in the private sector that he made his mark, leading major insurance and banking institutions, eventually becoming the CEO of Credit Suisse in Switzerland. Thiam's global network and clean political record made him an attractive alternative to the entrenched political class. His platform promised both economic modernization and political reform, blending his financial expertise with a promise of governance untainted by past conflicts. But his dual nationality became the weapon used to cut him from the race. The law requiring candidates to hold only Ivorian citizenship was enforced with precision, and although Thiam renounced his French citizenship before filing, authorities claimed he still held it during the candidacy process. To his supporters, it was a technical trap. To the government, it was simply the law. Guillaume Soro's fall from grace is one of the most dramatic in Ivorian politics. Once a rebel leader who helped bring Ouattara to power in 2011, he later served as Prime Minister and Speaker of Parliament. But his relationship with the president soured, and by 2019, he was living in exile, facing charges in Ivory Coast for embezzlement and plotting an armed insurrection, accusations he denies. Charles Bourgoud, known as a street general during the Gbagbo era, was once a fiery youth leader who could rally thousands with a single speech. Like Gbagbo, he was acquitted by the ICC, but his political ambitions remain viewed with suspicion by the current government. The simultaneous exclusion of these four figures, each with distinct bases of support, was no coincidence. For many, it felt like the field was being cleared for a predetermined outcome. Every Ivorian over the age of 20 remembers the 2010 to 2011 crisis. The scenes of burnt-out cars, roadblocks, and gunfire in Abidjan are seared into the nation's memory. Neighbors turned on each other, and families were split along political and regional lines. That memory haunts the current moment. Civil society leaders warn that history could repeat itself if the election is not perceived as fair. Religious leaders have called for calm, urging dialogue over confrontation, but their words compete with the frustration building on the streets. Ivory Coast crisis is being closely watched by its neighbors. For countries like Burkina Faso and Mali, now under military rule, the unrest could be seen as proof that civilian democracies are not immune to instability. For Guinea, where Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya ousted Condé in 2021, it is a reminder of the events that can trigger coups. ECOWAS, already stretched thin dealing with multiple crises, faces a dilemma: push too hard against Ouattara and risk alienating a key economic player, or stay quiet and watch another democratic precedent erode. International partners, especially France, the European Union, and the United States, walk the same tightrope. Ivory Coast is a strategic ally, but overt criticism could push Abidjan toward alternative partnerships with powers like China, Russia, or Turkey. For the average Ivorian, the politics of Abidjan can feel both painfully close and impossibly distant. Close, because political decisions can determine whether protests turn violent in their neighborhood. Distant, because many feel their voices don't count in the holes where decisions are made. In the cocoa fields, farmers speak less about term limits and more about the price they'll get for their beans, which has been squeezed by global markets. In the bustling markets of Treachville, traders care about whether customers have money to spend, not which legal clause is keeping Thiam off the ballot. And yet, even for those who feel detached from the day-to-day political drama, there is an understanding that instability can destroy livelihoods overnight. For many, the fear is not just about who wins. It's about whether the country will remain at peace long enough for them to keep working, farming, and raising their children. With weeks to go before the election, the streets are caught in an uneasy rhythm. By day, life continues. Taxis weave through traffic, merchants call out to customers, and school children in crisp uniforms walk to class. But by night, conversations turn tense. In homes, people debate whether to join protests or keep their heads down. In bars, the talk is of rumors. Who is financing the demonstrations, whether the army is truly neutral, and whether international observers will have any real influence. No one knows exactly how October 25th will unfold, but everyone knows it will be a turning point. Ivory Coast now stands at a dangerous crossroads. One path promises stability under a leader who has ruled for over a decade, but risks deepening political exclusion. The other demands openness, messy, unpredictable, yet essential for true democracy. The streets of Abidjan are sending a clear message. The people refuse to be silent spectators in their nation's story. As October 25th draws closer, the world will see whether the will of the people can overcome the will of power. If you found this breakdown insightful, subscribe for more deep dives into Africa's most pivotal political moments, and share your thoughts below.